Hey everyone, so today I'm going to walk you through the Culture is Chaos project file so that as you're looking through it, you can more easily understand what I was doing for each element. Um, I'm not going to go super in depth. I want this to be a pretty quick video, so I'm just going to hit every channel, the main highlights of what's going on, try to note anything that you might not be able to tell right off the bat just from looking at it, and hopefully that'll help you get a little bit more out of the project file. So, I'm just going to go top down. I like to group my drums with the kick, but not actually do anything to that group. This is purely organizational. I do have all of my drum tracks routed, as you can see here, to this drum bus. And this drum bus channel allows me to solo all of the drum parts except for the kick and process those all as I wish. And then the kick is separate. So I don't actually process my kick in a bus with anything, usually. Sometimes I will with like a bass or something, but in this project I did not. So my sidechain track is just a direct duplicate of my kick track. I don't use like a click track. I actually have it the full kick. I like to use the attack and release of the compressor to modify, how the pumping sounds. So kick, nothing special here. Always just try to pick a better sample than to over process a shitty sample. So I usually don't have a lot of processing. If anything, just a bit of EQ. Here, I ended up not even using it. So this top loop, once again, nothing special. I just have it sidechained to the kick so that the downbeats are not overlapping with the click of my kick that I already have. The open hat, also nothing really special here. You'll see that this ride has a bit of sidechain on it, just so when it starts coming in, it pumps a little bit off the kick. You'll notice that I have it automated to be off in the beginning, and the reason for that is because this shaker loop is sidechained to the open hat. And I wanted the pattern that is created from that sidechaining, that it's pumping every offbeat, to still be there even when the open hat isn't playing in the beginning of the intro. So that was just to keep a consistent pattern, because if I wasn't going to do that, like if I muted this, you can tell it's slightly different, and I just didn't want there to be like a change when the open hat comes in. Super subtle, doesn't really matter. The closed hat, this only comes in at the oops, did not want to do that. So the closed hat only comes in at the drop. It's got a little bit of modulation on it. So this LFO is controlling the decay, so you can tell it's getting a little bit longer and shorter. You can make that extreme so you could hear it more. And the offset is essentially just placing the LFO, or placing the start point of the decay lower so that the LFO is affecting it the same amount but on a lower scale. So here, it's cycling between a fairly high decay, like 400 milliseconds and 200, but then by the end, I want it to be even shorter, super staccato. So by the end, it's, cycling between 3 and 30 milliseconds. And that's just by automating the offset down. This LFO is available in Max for Live, which is with Ableton 10 Suite. I would really recommend it. It just allows you to modulate pretty much any parameter of any other plugin. So the snare, let's see if anything was going on here. I think it's just some layers and some saturation. This bright snare corpus preset is really nice for adding, snap to it. You can also make it in key, and you can bring the dry wet down significantly. So I would only have it at like between 5 and 10 usually. Otherwise it's way too extreme. A bit of EQ, some compression, some really short reverb with a bit of pre-delay just to thicken up a bit. And then that's sidechaining to the kick as well. That's more of a stylistic thing, honestly. It could go either way. This mid loop was a percussion loop that I made a while back and just had in a folder. It's using a single piece of percussion, like a little shaker or like knock thing, and then I had a bunch of grain delay in different patterns to create this, and then I reversed some of them after resampling it and got this. So not really much to learn from that, but it is just a loop that I made. This shaker loop, if we take the delay off, you'll notice it's not like a 16th pattern, it's a more unique pattern, but this delay, I have it set so that it basically sounds like a 16th pattern, but there's a lot of added width now because some of the delay is going to the left and some is going to the right. So that's a nice way to get some more width. I also have some overdrive, transient designer, just removing some of the sustain and upping the attack, and then a flanger just to give it a little bit more texture. And then this LFO tool is just dipping the last hit of the every 4. And I actually turn that off during the drop or during the breakdown when I want it to just be straight 16th notes. What do we got next? The rides. So this is a good way to get like the more techno style high rides. You can take just any sample or loop. You can tell this is like pretty abrasive, but I just liked it for the tone, so then I really drenched it in reverb. Compressed it so that it's just one solid volume of ride reverb. It's not, pumping up and down based on when the actual hits are. And then I can take that solid block and sidechain it to the kick so it pumps. Otherwise, so this is a little uneven. It's a little dynamic. Here I'm squashing it and then I'm making it pump on beat. Then we got some EQ and then delay for the Haas effect, just to really widen it up. Now the bongos. Here we have a cool trick where I'm essentially taking a bunch of different samples and doing a round robin randomization. So these are all slightly different, but similar enough. And then I have a MIDI random effect saying that 100% of the time it's going to pick one of 8 choices starting at, what note did I have? So I pick the high G sharp because everything below that, this is the G sharp, this is the G, F sharp, F, etc. So it's saying pick one of 8 choices below subtract from G sharp. So I play the G sharp MIDI note and then it just picks one of the 8 below it, and 100% of the time it's going to be random. So you can tell every time this plays it'll be a different combination of these. So the same MIDI pattern, but it's just picking a different sample. Then I have Pan Man just slightly panning it around. This bongo loop, pretty straightforward. Just a bongo loop, but did that again. But it is sidechained to the kick and to this electric perk that comes in later. So that it's not, the transients are just ducking a tiny bit for it. Now that electric perk, this was just a sound that I really saturated hard. And then I probably resampled it, and then I saturated some more, EQ, limited it so that the transient wasn't poking out too hard. So it's sort of just hard clipping, like chopping off the sharp tops. Doesn't really need to be super pokey because it's already a pretty distinct sound, so I didn't want that, triggering my mastering compressor and limiter and stuff. The mod perks, this is just some modular percussion that I made myself and just, recorded in and then looped it and reversed it and stuff. You can see there's some cool panning and some delay effects just to give it a lot of space. And this runs throughout the whole track just as a bit of, like atmosphere. These little chicks, I actually took the sub groove, and just did a ton of stuff to make it, like you can tell if I take this off. And these EQs. So it's actually the subgroove pitched up 3 octaves. It doesn't even really retain the tone. So I tremolate it. So this is just a tremolo doing a custom pattern. Then Decimort, which is a bit crusher, which just bit crushes it and gives it this nice, like, gritty texture. Then I EQ it. So I'm basically just taking that sub pattern and, you know, a roundabout way of making it into like a little extra hi-hat thing with some delay. Sort of adds a bit of width, and then I sidechain it to the hat. Kind of a very much like a last-minute ear candy thing, but it was nice just to add some variation to the drums in the second verse. Finally, this 808 conga, pretty straightforward. Just 808 conga sample that I did some amping to get it really crunchy, and then the LFO is also controlling the dry wet of that crunch, so it just gives it this texture that's slightly modulating higher and lower. Yeah, it's pretty much that. So then the drum bus, to top off the drums, we've got the drum bus plugin, some parallel compression. Transient designer to reduce the sustain and increase the attack just a tiny bit. This filter is just for the breakdown, I believe, when I'm filtering out. Yeah, just as I filter down the drums. Same with the reverb, I kind of wash it out during that breakdown. Then here, so I made this little signal chain, this little group, to simulate what the UAD Studer A800 is doing. This is a plugin that you can only have if you have UAD hardware, so a lot of you might not have it. It's basically a tape emulation plugin that I use to saturate my drum bus, which glues it together, adds harmonics, and just is a nicer way of enhancing the sound than just using EQ. However, I tried to simulate what it was doing with the EQ, so you can tell the difference. Brightens it up quite a bit. But, you know, this saturation and the EQ can also brighten it up. So this is just for those that don't have it. You can still hear the drums how they were intended to be, which is a little bit brighter than they were initially. Cool, so that covers the drums. Next, we've got the bass. Here you can see my bass group combines the sub, which I made on my modular synth. This bass stab, which I think I also did there. And then this sample, which is like a deep chord stab. And all that together is grouped, some parallel compression, sidechain, and then a bit of EQ. On the sub itself, you'll see I have it sidechained to that stab and to that deep chord just so it can duck a little bit and those elements can come up. We've got some saturation, some compression just to really squash it and make it a consistent, you know, sub blast. Here, the bass stab, pretty straightforward. This tremolator, it already had some stabbiness to it, but this was just making it a little bit stabbier and making it more staccato. Same with this transient designer, just reducing the sustain, boosting the attack. And then very narrow EQ just to get that one little blip and nothing else. The deep chord, just some saturation, a bit of delay to move it around the space a little bit, and then that narrow EQ as well. So that is the bass. Now for the musical parts, I actually route everything else besides the drums and the bass to a music bus, which is convenient for soloing it all just to hear it. I also use some tape saturation on that using the same plugin, and I use this washout audio effect rack that just does a lot of reverb, delay, and filtering, which gives her cool spatial effects. Yeah, so you can see. Yeah, so just some cool transitional effects, with a macro that controls all the musical parts. Um, let's actually get into the specifics, though. We have this synth strum sound, which was the arpeggios are both from my Prophet Rev 2, and this sound is from my modular. Let's take off some of the effects, and I'll just go one by one. So, this is just filtering it in and out for progression. There's a bit of auto pan on it. The low cut is also for like the transitional parts. Then we have some phase mistress. Subtle, but it's just adding a bit more depth and texture as it phases. The tremulator makes it progressively more and less stabby because I have the depth automated. So you can hear it's like really stabby here, but then during the transitions, I actually bring it down so it kind of bleeds out. So it's super staccato here, and then for the breakdown, obviously it stays, a 16th note pattern because that's in the original sound. But if we actually show how much more staccato it could be, yeah. So during the verses, I have it super staccato, and then that's sort of just teasing the sound, but then it gets really big here. This Mobius filter is a very specific plugin. It basically just creates a never-ending rising sound using shepherd tones. You can definitely look that up. There's probably other ways to do it that are, relatively easy with stock plugins. But it basically creates that rising whistling sound. Yeah, so most of it was a quick, repetitive loop, but this breakdown, there was obviously a lot of dynamic changes and automation, and that, I recorded live. So that covers that pretty much. The next we have the arpeggio, which plays throughout most of the track. This also, all the automation on the synth itself was on my hardware, so it's not going to be in here, but it's just one long recording. It just had some saturation, some EQ, some more EQ, and some delay, some reverb, and then 2 filters for transitions. So without some of the effects you might not have, it still sounds pretty similar. The saturation is just adding extra harmonics, thickening it up. And then, the echo and delay add space, and that's automated through the transitions as well. So those kind of wash it out a little bit. While I was making the track, I realized that this ARP felt a little thin, so I duplicated it and used Wave's sound shifter pitch stereo to lower it an octave. I think I did this because I probably used Ableton's algorithm, complex to lower it, and it just didn't sound as good. So instead I used this. I made it a little bit more mono because, the other arpeggio is already giving us a lot of the width. And I narrowed the EQ so we're just getting the lower octave, none of those extra harmonics. And this just beefs up the sound. It's really subtle, but it does just give it that lower overtone or undertone, whatever. So, throughout the song, it fills the space and just feels a little bit more beefy. And I think for this track in particular, that worked well because the sub bass and the whole bass groove really was very low and subby. There was not a lot of mid-range to it. So there's some space in, the 100 to 500 hertz range for this low ARP to exist. Here's the MIDI in case you're curious. Don't steal it, but, just to show you what was going on. This was all getting sent to my hardware, Prophet Rev 2. Now we have the effects. So some standard stuff like noise wash samples. We got the tremolator here just before the build-up because it gets a little staccato just to match everything else that's going on in the rest of the track. Drum roll, similarly, nothing too special, just some some effects samples that I made and just have in a folder. This was Snare Roll 8. So a lot of the effects were already built into it because I had made that a while ago and just had them saved. This breath, just a breath sample with some reverb that just builds the tension a little bit throughout. Nothing crazy. This sub drop, there's a bit going on here. So the way I was able to do the pitch changes was using operator's pitch envelope function. So this is just a standard sine wave playing a single note if I take this pitch envelope off. But I have the pitch envelope set to full, and then I have the sustain at -12, so it's gonna take 2 seconds to go from where it is 0 semitones to -12 semitones, an octave below, and then it's gonna sustain at that octave below before trailing off to a further octave below, 24 semitones. You don't really hear that because it's already so low. So by there, it stays, and then just sort of trails off. You can't really hear it. The reason I did it this way is because I wanted it to be a sub drop that then holds at the lower octave, and that really gives it a lot of tension. Yeah, so I thought, rather than just have a low note holding a sub drop into that would be pretty cool. And then using the overdrive was just for some extra saturation, and then, filtering out all the higher harmonics, but keeping a lot of that, extra stuff down here to fill out the space. So that's pretty simple to do on your own, rather than using a sub-drop sample where you can't really control the pitch as easily and that kind of stuff. These swooshes I think I also had made previously, so there's just reverb on them. And now we have the Atmos. So in the atmospheres, we've got a couple things going on. First, we have these chord sweeps that I recorded, and then just drenched in reverb and delay. We've also got these reverse metal clanging samples that give some nice transitional element. And I have the tremolator on there too, so that it chops it up into 16th notes. And you can see I've got some automation, so sometimes it starts full and then gets choppy, other times it starts choppy and then the reverb tail is full, so that just mixes it up a little bit. Got these breath samples, also just reverb and delay. Nothing crazy here. Then we have 3 textural loops or recordings. So this I think was a recording probably from Omnisphere that I made, and it's just changing harmonies throughout the song that just add to the space of it all and put the sub and the ARP and the other synths into a different context as those harmonies change tone. The main thing here is Valhalla Shimmer, which you can tell is adding that higher octave and just giving it a lot of air and movement. We have this ambience loop here. I'm not quite sure where this came from. It might have been a loop, or I might have made it. I don't really remember. Also using the shimmer to give it some air above and below, because dual it's doing an octave higher and an octave lower. Um, it's also got a lot of reverb, so it's really far in space. It's just kind of filling out the sound from the beginning and putting you like in a space, giving it a vibe. Then in the drop, I subbed it out for a similar loop that has some noise. And it's still, pretty subtle, but that just kind of elevates that final drop with an extra burst of noise. Then finally we have the background drone. This I think I also recorded. It might have been like a reverb tail that I resampled. And it's just pumping with the song. It comes in and out of this filter to add tension and, fill the space and add some drama. And that is pretty much it. I would say with these ambience things, this is just, to create a vibe and glue the whole track together and give it some character. But it's also useful for, progressing the song, as you can see in this channel, where it starts pretty filtered and then it keeps getting higher and higher. So it just sort of creates a little bit of a journey throughout the track. Now we'll go to the return tracks. So most of these are pretty straightforward. The first is just a drum reverb. Pretty short, cutting the lows. Next is a drum crush return that I use in a lot of my tracks. It's D16 Redopter, which is essentially just multi-band tube distortion. It could be any kind of distortion. The tube just sounds nice on drums. But the multi-band aspect is fairly important because it allows you to isolate sweet spots in your drum group. So like the snap of the clap, for instance, and just accentuate certain parts of the bus and give it a little bit more distortion, more harmonics. So you can tell it's pretty crunchy and it's mixed really far back just to thicken the drums and fill out the space. So I can do with and without it. So here's without it. And with it. So it just crunches it up a little bit and fills it out. The parallel compression is just giving a little bit of extra snap to the kick and the drum and the clap. Just to have them poke out a bit more. This chorus is using UAD's Studio D. It's a really transparent chorus, so much so that it doesn't give it a chorusy sound, it just kind of gives it some width. So that's just on certain elements that I thought could be a bit wider. It's just giving it a little bit more space. The Bit Crush, D16 Decimort, you can also use Ableton Redux. This is just giving a little bit of high-end bite to some of the elements, and you can see I filtered out some of the nastiness. But this just helps stuff poke out a little bit more. It's super subtle though. The melody delay is just used at certain times, I believe. Yeah, so it seems like I send the drums to it a couple times and the melody just during some of the transitions. You could use a regular echo for that. Same with the verb. I think this was just during the breaks and stuff. It's a very like spacey song, so there's a lot of delay and reverb tails that just kind of bleed through certain points. So I just had two buses to send something anytime I wanted to throw it into a delay or throw it into a reverb. This bowing up is using Crystallizer to add like little granules, and it's essentially a pitch delay, so it's only pitching it up 25 cents, so it gives this like spiraling upwards effect. So where do we send something to that? Let's see. I do it to the drums too. Interesting, yeah. Forgot about that. So let's see, find that open hat. Yeah, so that happens right here. So it's a nice little transitional effect as well. get just this in here. So you can hear those little flutters. Let's see, where else do I do it? So like here's another place. And where else? Like here. Oh, something's not right. See right here. Yeah, so it's making that little pitch up effect. You could also do that with a delay and some automation if you wanted to, just by changing the delay time and making sure repitch is selected. Next we have this guitar amp. This was just to give everything a little bit more drive and, you know, a bit of a metallic sound. Kind of crunch everything up a little bit. Not everything, but the synth parts. So without it. So it's subtle, but it just kind of thickens it up in the highs. And then finally we have this noise wash. This is just a reverb into another reverb and then slightly sidechained. And this just allows me to send, you know, the whole drum bus, for example, to this return and then get these cool noise washes. So it's just a transitional effect instead of using, you know, like a white noise sample. So that is everything. I purposely took the mastering chain off of this. It's not because I don't want you to know my secrets. I've covered my mastering chain, or at least my older one, without some of the new things I've been doing. But I've done that in previous courses on Sonic Academy on my YouTube. So if you really want to see it, you're welcome to. However, I took it off here because I really want to avoid people just copying it and pasting it on their track, because that's never going to work well. Mastering chains are fully dependent on the input gain that you're putting in and the character of the song and, you know, your different peak levels. So a lot of the times when I've seen some of my mentoring students having copied my mastering chain onto their tracks, it sounds like shit because they literally just copied and pasted it. And I don't blame them. Like, I used to do that too. It's just, you know, that's not really how mastering works. You can't just copy the same settings. It's all dependent on the input gain of the track and the type of track. So I'd rather people try to figure out, you know, what each plugin does and do it themselves than just copy and paste it. So I didn't want to create any problems by, you know, opening that door here. But, you know, if you want help on mastering, you can reach out. You can watch my other videos. I definitely have covered it before. So hopefully this was helpful. I tried to be super fast with it so as to not bore anyone. If this is really helpful and you've learned a lot from going through the project file, definitely reach out. I'd love to hear what you think about it. Open to any feedback, things I could do better next time, things that I didn't cover, or, you know, questions you have about the track. I also offer one-on-one mentoring. I'm usually pretty booked up, but, you know, with the quarantine, there's a bit more free space. But if you're interested in that, you can also email me at hello@enamourmusic.com. It's also in the README file. So I hope this was helpful. Hopefully you've learned something, and you can check my YouTube for more videos and stay tuned for more things like this. Thanks.